All right, back again. Time to go over the mana in this deck. A little less exciting than the spells, but no less important. Starting off, I mentioned before about how despite 4 Horsemen encompassing the 4 expansions that came after the Alpha set and actually Beta too, I guess Unlimited and Arabian Nights came out about around the same time, we ultimately decided that it would be in the best interest of the format to allow the Alpha dual land cycle to flourish. And my reason for that was there were a lot of decks that people wanted to play, but they had just glaring weaknesses by nature of the fact you couldn't really run much more than a monocolor strategy and get away with it. So if you wanted to run a red-white deck, for example, you were forced to, I guess red-white's not such a great example. Let's say blue-black or something like that. Just a deck that doesn't really have any direct way to deal with artifacts very well. Well, if you can run bayous, or you can run volcanic islands, or you can run tundras, or whatever, scrublands, etc., then you can splash some of the other utility cards to shore up some of the weaknesses that your deck might have against artifacts, which are all over the format. And on top of that, a lot of the cards from this era, this is something I talked about a lot back in the 7-point old school singleton days, lots of cards from this era, particularly a lot of the good ones, have double color specifics. Casting cost, double blue for counter spells, moat, preacher, other things in the sideboard. There's lots and lots of cards that cost double and even triple of a color. And when your entire mana base is basic lands and you only have 4 copies of City of Brass for color fixing, it's really, really easy to get entire hands where you just can't cast half the spells in your hand because you haven't even drawn a single copy of a land of that color, and you don't have any fetching and no card draw and no tutoring. There's just no way to really do it short of just getting lucky and top decking off the top of your deck. And that's just a kind of a crappy feeling for anybody who's trying to enjoy a new format. So I thought that the dual lands would add a lot to the format, and it seems to have been borne out by the results. Quite a few decks were utilizing at least a splash of dual lands alongside the format's really powerful lands to cast their spells. But I got 4 copies of Tundra. It's a blue-white deck, right? Of course, I'm gonna have 4 of those. I have 4 copies of City of Brass, not just for the good mana fixing and for access to green, but also because, of course, its interactions, as I mentioned before, the synergy between Mirror Universe and City of Brass gives you just an autonomous kill engine that is quite easy to get online and very hard to interact with. I've got 1 copy each of Tropical Island and Savannah. I actually initially had 2 Tropicals, no Savannahs. Nate suggested making that swap just to get a little bit more white mana into the deck, and I do agree with him, actually. It's pretty much even in terms of blue and green mana across the whole deck, and in fact, the mana symbols in the deck are pretty close to even too, so I think that was a good change. I've got 4 copies of Strip Mine in the deck, and this is, I'm sure, very controversial to people who come from other old school formats where Strip Mine is a restricted card. And I really do think that I have mixed feelings about the card. I think that it has a place as a 4 of. It's definitely a really nice sanity check in a format that has things like 4 workshops, obviously Library of Alexandria, 4 copies of Mishra's Factory, and I think you kind of just, I think it's necessary. I just think that the format is hurt more by restricting Strip Mine than it is helped by allowing people to play with 4, and part of the reason for that, actually, is the fact that, contrary to popular belief, I consider Strip Mine to be one of the most important and skill-testing tools and cards in all of old school format. And one of the things that makes the card so good is the fact that it gives you the ability to be rewarded for paying close attention to sort of some of the intangible things that actually unfold in a game of Magic. For example, what order is your opponent playing their lands in? How are they reacting when they draw a card from their library? How eager are they to put it directly into play versus holding it in their hand and thinking? People communicate a ton of information about their mana base in particular, because a lot of people, certainly when the game starts, they view the mana base and the mana development as being a very kind of precarious and uncomfortable component of playing a game of Magic. And a lot of people cannot help but communicate their frustration or delight very transparently with their eyes and with their body language and how they draw cards and stuff, particularly as it pertains to mana. And if you pay attention to that sort of thing, as you should do if you are someone who takes these formats seriously, and you watch your opponent when they draw their card, you can often figure out whether or not your opponent is happy with their mana or is unhappy with it, based entirely on their body language. And that communicates a ton of information about whether or not you should use Strip Mines, and when you do use Strip Mines, what you should use them for. But I love the idea of just keeping Strip Mines in play. It gives you protection against out-of-control library if it should show up in a game, and allows you to punish your opponent for using Mishra's Factories during their attack step, because they have to devote essentially 2 mana, and you only have to use the Strip Mine, an untapped Strip Mine, so it's trading 1 for 2 and quite a bit of tempo. And of course, there's also the fact that Mishra's Workshop is one of the most powerful cards in this entire format, and killing your opponent's workshops, assuming that they don't have something more dangerous to deal with that's an immediate concern, is incredibly important, because the one way you can really rein in the workshop deck is if you kill its workshops and they're not able to play those gigantic creatures discounted, they just wind up being only able to do one thing a turn, and that is usually not enough to keep a foothold in the game and to win. So I consider Strip Mine just to be kind of a necessary evil in a lot of formats. And in the formats where you have more kind of agency over the game and people play with the more precarious mana bases and stuff, Strip Mine allows you to really utilize an entire skill component to rein in your opponent's development, and sometimes just win games entirely by shutting them off a color and giving one type of permanence you might control just free reign to rule over the battlefield until they draw into the right colors of mana. So I love the card. It's good to have 4, and I'm glad that it's an unrestricted card in 4 Horsemen. I'll certainly continue to advocate for that. I do have the obligatory Library of Alexandria. This is going into the later formats. I think the fifth version of this, fifth tournament for this format. Library of Alexandria is, I think, the lone restricted card now that Golgothian Silex and City in a Bottle have been banned. This card, of course, belongs on the restricted list completely. It's totally stupid and oppressive and tends to ruin a lot of games that it shows up in, but at least you got 4 Strip Mines to counteract it. And I would say that Library is not at its peak power in 4 Horsemen compared to the way that it is in Alpha, primarily because you don't have 5 Moxes, Lotus, and Soul Ring to continue to accelerate your development while you're drawing 2 cards a turn. But there's enough stuff that's cost 1 mana, 2 mana, that you can deploy alongside Library, that you can pretty much use the card non-stop throughout the whole game and you never have to discard. And that is very, very problematic and needs to be, I mean, you kind of just need to deal with the card. And there's no Anka Mishra, there's no Black Vice in the format either to punish the card, which is one of the other ways that people have figured out in old school to rein in Library when Strip Mine is restricted. And so you got to have, my general take on this is that if Library is legal in the format, you kind of just got to let 4 Strip Mines exist to counteract that, because the card is just so overwhelmingly strong. Finally, I've got seven basic lands in the deck. I have 3 islands, 3 plains, and a single lone forest. At one point, I think I had 4 plains, 3 islands, and no forest. Actually, I had the forest in, then I took it out, and then I eventually put it back in because I thought that having a forest to fetch with land tax in order to get the Sylvans online was an important enough thing that it was likely to come up often enough that I cared about it. And I think I was pretty much proven right by the games I played. I definitely tutored up that forest a number of times, which allowed me to get access to green mana without taking damage off City of Brass, and it was a pretty nice little luxury to have. So I do think that this is the right composition of basic lands. You might wonder, why don't you have only 7 basic lands with 4 copies of land tax? But the truth of the matter is, land tax is really only in the deck as just a tempo controller and a way to just assure that you have a steady flow of lands at the beginning of the game. Once you get to mid-game, it's fine. If you've taxed all the lands out of your deck, which I do frequently, you don't really worry about it. You don't have to draw them anymore. It's fine that if they're in the graveyard. But sometimes you can also take your time with land tax and just pick up 1 to 2 basic lands. You kind of just have to monitor and audit the state of the game. If you're in a situation where you're just starving for card quality and your opponent's putting a lot of pressure on you, then by all means just pull all the lands out of the deck as quickly as you can to dilute it. But be on the lookout for opportunities where you can actually just pull 1 to 2 lands a turn out of the deck until you have all of them and you never have to discard, which is even better. But you do have these other discard outlets to utilize the extra basic lands, including the 2 recalls and the Jalem Tome. So they go together pretty well. I'm going to move over to the sideboard since the lands aren't that interesting. So this sideboard was really the consequence of the playtest games that I played against Nate. And we played a ton of games together. I want to say like a dozen at least. And then I played a bunch of games on my own as well, just playing solitaire. And I was very, very happy with the sideboard. It would be hard, I think, to improve this based on the data that I collected in terms of the difficult matchups that my deck has. And one thing you need to always consider when you're building a sideboard is, well, there's a lot of maxims for this, but to sort of summarize them, first of all, figure out where your deck is likely to lose to. There may be lots of cards you want to consider for the sideboard that might make your deck better against something, better against a particular strategy, but you need to test those matchups and figure out whether or not the deck is threatening enough that you need to devote extra sideboard slots to it. It feels good to just make your deck better in certain matchups, but it may ultimately not be necessary. It may be more important to add more cards to your sideboard that specifically deal with a certain deck type that's very highly problematic than it is to kind of just devote 2 to 3 sideboard cards to all the different deck types you're likely to face. And then you just wind up making your deck a little stronger against matches that it's already strong in. The way that my philosophy about this generally is that figure out what decks are most likely to beat you, particularly in game one, and over sideboard heavily against those decks so that you can increase your chances of winning games 2 and 3 to the point where you've got maybe a margin of 75 to 80% favored in games 2 and 3. And that way, combined with your play skill and assuming your opponent doesn't get super lucky, should give you enough of an edge to prevail in the match itself, even after losing game one. And so the data that I found was that probably the most threatening deck in this format for my deck to deal with was just big artifact creatures, particularly big artifact creatures that fly. And the format has both Clockwork Avian, which seems so hilariously bad measured against lots of other creatures that you regularly see in old school, but in this format, it's a 5 mana 4/4 flyer that's an artifact creature, so it survives Abyss, it flies over moat, and the 5 casting cost is honestly just very often like 3 casting cost because of Mishra's Workshop. So Avians can come out quickly. They're bigger. I didn't mention this before, but they're bigger than Serendib Efreet, of course, so they can beat Serendib in the air, at least for a turn or two. And they're very threatening. You can't just take hits from a Clockwork Avian all day long. And there's always creatures like Suchi, Triskelion, Tetravis. Those are kind of like the main big offenders. There were some people that were tinkering around with Colossus of Sardia in the format as well, although I didn't see any decks doing well that use Colossus of Sardia, but it is definitely a thing. You can also use Transmute Artifact with Colossus of Sardia. You bring out like a Triskelion for 6 off of Workshops, attack for a couple turns, use the arms, and then transmute it into something much bigger like a Colossus of Sardia. So in the testing that I did, it just seemed like my chances of losing to the big artifact deck with no main deck artifact kill, if I don't draw Moat, is basically no chance. You can't really beat that deck without Moat. And even when you get Moat, they have enough flyers. If they put pressure on you already, they can just recurse Triskelions and stuff through Tanos' Coffins. They basically just burn you out with Triskelions. And I just thought that my deck was so poorly suited against artifact that I needed to kind of go overboard with my sideboard slots against that. So to that end, I'm running 2 copies of Dust to Dust, a horribly narrow card with a very clunky casting cost, but strong enough that it's a backbreaking effect against the artifact decks, which run upwards of 20 different targets for that. I have 3 copies of Divine Offering, my sort of favorite artifact killer. Works extremely well against all of the most of the artifacts in the format, with the exception of the Triskelion, because they can deny you the 6 points of life by pinging you twice with the first 2 arms and then having the Triskelion shoot itself. But ping 2 mana to kill a 6 mana thing and only taking 2 damage from it is pretty decent. And so with the 3 Divine Offering in the sideboard, that takes me up a total of 4 with 6 devoted artifact kill spells specifically for that matchup. I've got another Moat, super, super amazing in the Workshop matchup, also just good in general against any of the aggro strategies in the format. And I thought it was very important to get up to 4 of those. And I've got another Preacher here, and I'm not really too happy about this guy, considering how often I was sideboarding out Preacher, but there definitely are some decks in the format that Preacher just gives total headaches to. In fact, one of the decks in the finals, oh wait, no spoilers there. A deck in the finals is basically this Blue Skies thing, and Preacher is just incredibly strong against him. He doesn't really have any way to remove Preacher, and if you've got an active Preacher in play, what's the situation where it doesn't just absolutely destroy him? You can just steal a Zephyr Falcon, or steal a Flying Man, or steal a Serendib Efreet, and they can't attack ever because they're just going to kill their own guys off, and you just untap the Preacher and steal something else. So the card, like I said before, when it shines, it really, really shines, and I decided to run a 3rd copy of it because I had pulled one of the Preachers out of the sideboard earlier. I'm not sure if that's correct, though. Moving on, I've got 2 copies of Time Elemental, and this was sort of a last-minute edition. I never actually tested the Time Elementals, but I was kind of worried about the control matchup, particularly opposing Time Elementals, and it can come down really quickly. I mean, they can play a Time Elemental on turn 2 off of an Elves of Deep Shadow or something, and they certainly cast it on turn 3 and have it active on turn 4, and a control deck that's planning on playing this very slow incremental game is just given fits by Time Elementals. Extremely difficult, problematic, permanent to play around. You don't really want to have to deal with it. And I figured that having Time Elementals would just give me that edge in matchups against similar decks, which I expected to face. And the card's just overall good. It just has some nice flexibility. It's unlikely I'd be able to do it, but against a deck that might put Blood Moon into play, Time Elemental gives me the ability to unsummon Blood Moon and then counter it later. It also gives you some ability to control the quantity of lands in play. To utilize land tax, you can fill your hand back up to turn library back on, or to feed yourself extra life from Ivory Tower and stuff. The card's just really interesting and flexible, and I was very glad to have him. I used him in multiple matchups, so I think that was correct. I've got 2 copies of Amnesia, which is You know, like there's definitely a version of this deck out there that is really just leaning heavily on Mana Drain, Mirror, and Amnesia. Those three combined effects to just kind of do naughty things early with Mana Drain mana. But the problem with Amnesia, obviously, for that plan is the triple blue. And I just didn't think that this deck has enough blue mana sources to reliably do that. I mean, I've got, what is that? It's 12. Yeah, 12 actual blue producers plus potentially Felwar Stones, but not enough blue mana to reliably get blue, 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 particularly in a format that has 4 strip mines. And so Amnesia is much more of kind of a mid to late game card, at least in this deck. I did like having it as just another tool against control. And you can see that my deck is sort of split in terms of its sideboard mostly between anti-artifact and anti-control elements. And I think that 2 Amnesias is probably correct. I did not think the card was strong enough or reliable enough to main deck, but some people might choose otherwise. I think you could certainly justify running at least 1 copy main deck. And then finally, the MVPs of my deck and sideboard. One of my favorite creatures of all time, Old Man of the Sea. This guy is such a sleeper. I never ever see Old Man played in old school. I love it in singleton formats, just have been in love with the card since I played 7.0 old school singleton. In fact, one of the very, very first decks that I ever built, going all the way back to mid-1994 before I built the deck, was a deck that used Old Man of the Sea and Blessing and Diamond Valley. So I'd throw Blessing on Old Man of the Sea, pump him up with it to make him larger. That made him big enough to steal any creature in play. I'd steal their best guy and then sacrifice it to Diamond Valley and then untap the old man, pump him again and steal another thing. And then after all their guys were dead, I would just pump the old man up to 6 power, 7 power and beat them down with it. So I had 4 copies of Old Man a long, long time ago. I had to eventually sell them, I think, years ago. But my recent sort of forays into these alternate old school formats compelled me to acquire more Old Men of the Sea again. And I just love playing with this creature. It's just so amazing. It's just the targeted Vidalcan Shackles. It has an incredible stat line. A lot of people don't even know that the card is this big. It's a 3 mana 2/3, and that may not seem like much. I mean, it's essentially a Hurloon Minotaur, but a 3 mana 2/3 in blue in this era is pretty rarefied, actually. It's big enough to beat all the 2/2s. It can block Mishra's Factories and can steal anything. And then with the Felwar Stones, of course, and Cities of Brass, you can steal utility creatures like Scavenger Folk, for example, with Old Men of the Sea, and use your opponent's creatures against them. But it's such a good card, and it just solves so many problems. It kills aggro decks completely, just kills them stone cold dead. You have an Old Man of the Sea. If they don't kill it with a Chain Lightning or maybe an active Volcano, they can't really mount any type of offense. You steal a Curd Ape or a Barbary Ape or a Factory or a Scavenger Folk, Flying Man, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's ground creature or flying creature. And the swap of pulling out creatures and replacing them with Old Men was something I did against every deck. I think that I may have actually used Old Man of the Sea in every single matchup because they're great against creature decks and they're great against control decks also in game 2 and game 3 when your opponent brings in cards like Time Elemental. And in fact, one of the games that I played, I think against my 3rd round opponent, he cast a Time Elemental and I had Old Man of the Sea in play. He also had a Sinbad in play too. Oh, that's right, I had a Preacher in that game. Yeah, he had a Sinbad and a Time Elemental, and I bounced his Sinbad with my Time Elemental and then used my Preacher to steal his Time Elemental, and then I attacked him with his own Time Elemental to take 5 and to destroy it, and then I untapped my Preacher and could steal something else. But Old Man obviously doesn't even need to do that. He can just steal a Time Elemental right out of the gate. And there were multiple games where my opponents had Time Elementals in their hand that they couldn't play because I had an Old Man of the Sea out and active. Just absolutely love the creature. It's just good against nearly every deck in the format and can't recommend it enough. Oh, and a very important thing too, for those who don't necessarily own or don't want to acquire for Old Men of the Sea, one thing that's great about 4 Horsemen is that it is a proxy-friendly format. So if you don't own 4 Old Men of the Sea, you can actually just go ahead and print up 4 of them, and now you've got 4 Old Men of the Sea, and you can play with them and find out how wonderful he is too. So that's the sideboard right there. I'm going to be covering some games that I actually played in the format in the days ahead, doing co-commentary with my friend Nate. The games from the format for those who are actually interested in this. So I'll be talking more at length about sideboarding choices and why I did that for fans of the format. But I just wanted to cover sideboard, land, deck list, boxes, 4 Horsemen, guys. This is a pretty cool format, actually. I think it's worth, if you're into these older, kind of more niche, old school formats, I think it's absolutely worth taking a look at. There is a Facebook group devoted to 4 Horsemen. The creators and players are all a really, really good bunch of guys who are just eager to try something new in old school. Very welcoming group. No stakes, no pressure, just fun magic with old cards, just like we always enjoy it. So I hope you guys If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to comment below and definitely give the format a try. Go check out the Facebook group. If you need any help making inroads with that, just feel free to reach out to me. And look forward quite soon to some games from not only playtesting on Magic Online, but also some games from the tournament itself, which I hope to produce in the next week or so. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later. Bye.